Alright, so here we are on the draw. Gonna keep this one. We have a turn one play, Birds of Paradise, and we have an Eldrazi temple to follow that up. So hopefully our birds lives, and we'll see what our opponent's playing here in a second. Alright, so looks like we're about to mirror our opponent with a copy of Birds of Paradise. Whoopsies. Alright, here's the birds. And next turn, we may have a choice in terms of playing either Matter Shaper or the Eldrazi Displacer. If we say player Eldrazi Temple, play Matter Shaper, that would allow us to also leave up Path to Exile. If we draw something like Thought Knot, then we're quite likely to play that, but it looks like our opponent is playing Naya, so we're going to most likely just play Matter Shaper on our turn. And we'll see what variation of Naya our opponent's playing. So that Cavern of Souls gives us access to white mana for our Displacer, but not for our Path to Exile. So we don't have an actual white producing land for Path. We have semi-white land right now in Cavern. And it looks like our opponent is going to fetch. I'm expecting some sort of a big creature, a big play for this turn. We'll see what that may be. And it looks like it's going to be a Kitchen Finks. So, not the worst for us. We definitely have ways of dealing with that card. And our opponent may be a little bit flooded. We don't really know. This Windswept Heath means that now we do have access to white mana for Path. So we have a bit of a choice here. We can Path the Finks, or we can just play the Displacer. I think we just want to play Displacer here. If our opponent does attack with Finks, I think we're pretty happy to just block with our Matter Shaper. So, no reason not to name Eldrazi with Cavern, and just play Displacer. Next turn, we will have the option of playing Reality Smasher. So, we won't be unhappy if our opponent attacks with Finks. Matter Shaper is very good against these types of decks, and it looks like our opponent is actually playing even more colors than straight Naya, so it could be a 4-color deck we're up against. It could be 5 colors. We'll have to see. So our opponent is attacking, so we're just going to go with the plan that we set out for the turn, and that's blocking with Matter Shaper. Our opponent's going to get back Kitchen Finks, but we're going to get a Thought Knot Seer. So now we're pretty incentivized to play Thought Knot depending on what our opponent does for the turn. We can also potentially have Path mana up. So I think we want to play Thought Knot just to see what's going on. There's definitely an argument to just playing Reality Smasher because it's pretty likely our opponent just doesn't have anything here. But yeah, let's go ahead and play the Thought Knot Seer. And this could be a removal spell in response, could be a Chord calling, could be, okay, it's a Restoration Angel. That's a little bit annoying, because it gets Restoration Angels able to reset the Kitchen Finks. But we're still going to get a Finks out of our opponent's hand, And we're just going to play this Plains and leave up Path to Exile. We may want to path the Resto Angel, but I don't think there's a need to fire it off unless we feel the need to. Right now, we're not in any danger life-wise. So if our opponent just attacks with the Restoration Angel, I think we probably just want to take the hit. It looks like we're playing a version of Kiki Chord, most likely. And so it looks like our opponent's draw step for the turn was a Noble Hierarch. So we can path the Restoration Angel if we want to. We could also path the Kitchen Finks if we wanted to. There's a few different options. We can also just take this hit. Pathing the Resto is probably the safest play, just because our opponent could draw Kiki at some point in the game, or draw a Chord to get Kiki Jiki. So I think we just want to get this Resto off the table, just to be safe, because we are going to be pretty far ahead, especially once this Reality Smasher hits play. So yeah, let's just go ahead and play our Reality Smasher. And I like attacking here with both Thought-Knot Seer and Smasher, and then we're going to leave the Displacer back because we don't want Displacer trading for Kitchen Finks. We're fine if our opponent wants to chump block. It looks like they chose not to chump block though. So we're pretty far ahead as of right now. Our opponent can attack us with the Finks, which would put us down to 16 as the board stands. So that's not a huge danger. And it looks like our opponent is going to make that attack. But I don't think we're in any danger unless our opponent's drawn one of their big spells for the turn. So we'll see if that actually happened. Okay, it's a Siege Rhino, so maybe it's, we don't know exactly what we're up against. We see Siege Rhino. It's pretty good here. In fact, we're still going to go ahead and fetch. Getting a blue source. Get a Hallowed Fountain. So we do only have lands in hand, but we're going to have to figure out how we want to navigate this board, because Displacer is good, but we don't really want to be displacing cards like Kitchen Finks and cards like Siege Rhino if we can avoid it. So if we did displace the Siege Rhino here, our opponent would go all the way up to 18. It seems like we likely do not want to do that here. So let's just go ahead and attack with Reality Smasher. It's pretty unlikely our opponent's going to block the Smasher. So yeah, it looks like the call is just taking the damage from the Reality Smasher. And now we can just pass with double Displacer activation up. I don't think we need to displace our Thought-Knot Seer here, because we could see what our opponent has drawn with Thought-Knot plus Displacer, but that would leave us unable to make any blocks. So it looks like our opponent is coming in here with Kitchen Finks. So we've got a couple of options here. We can block with Thought-Knot Seer and then displace it and see our opponent's hand, and so that is actually pretty appealing. We can also just take the damage, but I think I like just blocking with Thought-Knot, and then we're going to be able to displace the Thought-Knot. Now this is a little bit risky because our opponent could draw an instant speed card that would make this play bad, because like an instant speed card like a Chord or a Resto Angel or something of that nature is going to be pretty annoying, because our opponent's going to be able to use it immediately before we get to see their. So we're stacking it in such a way that our opponent's going to draw the card from the Thought Knot leaving play, and is then going to reveal their hand. It looks like something was drawn. We don't know if this resto was drawn off the Thought Knot or off of the draw step. It could have easily been either. But it looks like resto is threatening to blink the Siege Rhino. So what we can do here is, instead of letting our opponent blink the Rhino and letting the Rhino come into play untapped, we can just blink the Rhino ourselves with our Displacer. They're still gonna get that Siege Rhino trigger, but it's gonna be tapped. So that's the benefit of doing that right now. Now we see the Flooded Strand in our opponent's hand. So that didn't work out the best for us. As it turns out, our opponent had a flash creature, but we're still in the game. If we want to here, we can displace the resto and attack with the team. That would likely force our opponent to chump block our Displacer, or at least chump block the Thought Knot. I think better than that, though, we just want to attack with Thought Knot and Reality Smasher, and then just play our Birds of Paradise here. So let's go ahead and do that. Our opponent's pretty incentivized to just go ahead and chump block the Thought Knot and take the 5 from the Smasher. So it looks like that's what's going to happen. And we do have one more basic in our deck, which we can fetch for with the Windswept Teeth if we want to. We're just going to play birds, pass it back, and see what our opponent wants to do here. It's a pretty close game, so if our opponent does draw something, it looks like just a birds for the draw step, so it's not that bad for us, actually. Almost a brick, but not fully a brick, because it's still another chump blocker, potentially. We have double Displacer activation up, plus even another Displacer activation on our turn, potentially. Our opponent is making an attack here with Siege Rhino, okay? So we can think about how we want to navigate this situation. We could blink the Siege Rhino, definitely a possibility. We could also go ahead and blink the Restoration Angel. And so what that does is it forces our opponent to pick a target for the Resto trigger. So I actually kind of like blinking Resto right now, and we're going to blink likely what our opponent ends up targeting with the Restoration Angel. So it's kind of may not make a lot of sense initially, but it seems like the right play. So let's go ahead and blink Restoration Angel, and we're gonna see if our opponent wants to blink their Siege Rhino that's attacking to gain some life. They can also blink the Kitchen Finks. But what we're gonna do is, if this Resto ends up targeting the Finks, what we're going to do is we're going to sack our Windswept Heath, get our last basic out of our deck, and we are going to then blink this Kitchen Finks just so it's tapped. So what we're doing basically is we're going to be able to clear our opponent's board now, and I believe we're going to be able to attack for lethal on our turn. So we're just going to take the 5 here from the Rhino, fall to 3, and we're going to fall to potentially down to 1 with this Temple Guard in here. And we actually drew Reality Smasher, so that may change the math here. Either way, we had our opponent dead, because what we can do is, if we hadn't drawn the Smasher, we just play Temple, we can activate Eldrazi, Displacer, and blink all 3 of our opponent's creatures. We know our opponent has a land in hand. Now that we've drawn Smasher, we can also just simply play the Reality Smasher and bash. So yeah, let's just go ahead and do that. Because Smasher has trample, We don't actually need to blink anything before blocks. We can just attack with the entire team. And if our opponent puts anything on a Reality Smasher, we're just going to go ahead and blink that creature. And we're going to be able to win the game from there. So it's going to be 10 trample damage coming across. So, alright, let's go to game 2. One of the cards we would think about boarding in here is Grafdigger's Cage. We don't know, though, if our opponent actually has Chord in their deck. We've seen Rhino and Restoration Angel, but we don't actually know completely what we're up against here, which is a little bit scary. So we have to think about what our best options are to board in given what we've seen. So Dismember can kill a Resto or a Siege Rhino, so it seems like a card we may want. Thragtusk also is pretty good at battling Siege Rhino. It's reasonably likely our opponent does have Chord in their deck. So we could still potentially board in some Skites. I mean, some Cages. I meant to say that I don't think we want Skite, based on what we've seen so far. So, if we take out the Spell Skites, here we are. I think we still want to board in these Grafdigger's Cages. They're pretty good against Kitchen Finks, and what we've seen so far from our opponent. And we could board in the Bribery. Bribery can find a Siege Rhino or a Restoration Angel. We know that much, so we could have fun and try it, board it in. The Sky Spawners are probably a little bit unnecessary. They're pretty good, but we don't really need them, I don't think. We can just go. We're just trying to go bigger than our opponent here. So let's try taking him out for game 2, and we'll see if we want to board him in for game 3, if there is a game 3. So here we have a turn 1 Noble. Normally, turn 1 Noble is a good thing. We have multiple Thought Knots that we want to be able to get going here as quickly as possible. So if we do draw an Eldrazi Temple, that would be our best draw, because it could potentially enable a turn 2 Thought Knot. Otherwise, we're going to be left trying to cast Ancient Stirrings to find something on our turn, which isn't the best if our opponent has a 3-drop here. Could be a Kitchen Finks. It is a Kitchen Finks. So let's see what our draw step is here. It is just a basic forest. So we're going to go ahead and Ancient Stirrings. And we've got a couple of big spells here. So we're just going to grab the Drowner because we already have a Reality Smasher. Not exactly what we were looking for there, but we're just going to have to wait until next turn to cast one of these Thought Knots. And so we are behind in the early game here. If our opponent has a Restoration Angel, for instance, then we're in trouble. Just because that's a card that is going to be hard to deal with given the contents of our hand. And we're already taking some damage now from the Kitchen Finks. Our opponent passing the turn also makes it more likely for them to actually have that Restoration Angel, just because they didn't do anything. But we're still going to cast the Thought Knot, see what's going on here. And alright, it's going to be a Path to Exile, so our opponent's going to get to draw a card because our Thought Knot is gone. We found our last basic in our deck, But actually, it looks like our opponent's on all lands. So, that is good news for us. Couldn't ask for much better in terms of the contents of our opponent's hand. Our Thought Knot is gone, but if our opponent keeps drawing lands, we're just going to be able to win with these Eldrazi creatures. So we can play Drowner of Hope on our next turn. We can also play Reality Smasher. Drowner's the most efficient of the options. It's also pretty nice to just have a 5/5 back against the Kitchen Finks for blocks. It's interesting because our opponent knew we had Drowner, but was still forced to path the Thought Knot and provide us this Drowner on our next turn. And now we definitely want to play Drowner because we're going to start with Drowner, and then on our next turn we can potentially just play Displacer and start displacing the Drowner. If our opponent doesn't do anything and attacks, we can block with the Drowner as well. But it looks like our opponent's getting pretty unlucky to be flooding out here. But that's the danger of playing a bunch of mana creatures and a bunch of lands. We're playing similar, but we also have Ancient Stirrings to find our big cards. And so we can play the Smasher if we want to and just get aggressive. Or we can play the Eldrazi Displacer game. I think either option is going to work out pretty well for us. So I think we just want to go ahead and attack with the Drowner. Our opponent may want to just block with Kitchen Finks. And you know what? That's fine. If that's what our opponent chooses to do. We're not in a huge rush. We do want to win the game as quickly as possible, but we can actually just play the Displacer, and we could also play Thought Knot. But I think we just want to play Displacer and we're just going to go ahead and play another land and then displace our Drowner. And so now we have 2 more Eldrazi Scions. And we'll definitely be able to use these Scions to our advantage. We don't even really need to commit more threats to the board once we have Drowner plus Displacer going. Alright, we're just going to take the 1 here from the birds. Our opponent could have a Siege Rhino or something of that nature. Oh wow, so it's actually a Magus of the Moat. So that is pretty annoying for us. That's going to change the game pretty significantly. So we are unable to make any sort of headway with our creatures as they stand. So things were looking quite good for us. Now the situation has changed pretty significantly. We can start to displace this Magus, but I think we pretty much need to draw a removal spell for the Magus. So we can start off with the Thought Knot Seer to just make sure our opponent doesn't have anything in hand. So let's do that. Yep, our opponent has 2 lands. So we're kind of just waiting to draw paths. We know that there are a couple on the bottom of our deck, which is a little bit annoying, but We can actually play a birds and start chipping in with the Birds of Paradise. So, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And just play a land. Now our play of Slow Rolling Drowner does look a little bit worse because we could have gotten in a bit more damage. Yeah, let's just go ahead and tap this birds down. And we can actually just go ahead and blink our Drowner out. So let's do that. So yeah, let's just start chipping in with this Birds of Paradise. And we're basically looking to find paths, so we may actually want to use this Ghost Quarter on one of our own lands, even though we have no basics, just to look for the path, although we see now our opponent has Celestial Colonnade, so that may make us want to use the Ghost Quarter less. We'll just take this one from the birds. And let's go ahead and displace our Drowner a bit more. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Yep, displace the Drowner. So it looks like our opponent's just playing something weird that we're just not used to seeing. It's not a typical modern deck, but sometimes you get an advantage out of that. We were not expecting to see Magus. That's for sure. So let's make a bunch of Scions so that if we do draw a path, we can just win. We can also draw Dismember actually as well. So, yep. Just gonna go ahead and continue getting in with the Birds of Paradise. Pretty crazy situation we're in right now. I think we're gonna want to actually crack this Ghost Quarter just to shuffle our removal spells, because we remember seeing some of them earlier off of the Ancient Stirrings. And there is an Eternal Witness. That's going to find Path. So that's kind of annoying, because now our Displacer can get pathed. And our opponent may just cast it right now. I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Okay, so it is going to be a path on the Displacer. So let's just go ahead and get some activations in on our Drowner while we can. And this is also going to allow us to shuffle our deck, so we don't need to bother with the Ghost Quarter. So it's interesting because I'm not sure our opponent is going to have a good way to kill us. We're just looking for one of our removal spells, and then we should be able to win from there. So we see what we've got left. We're just going to go ahead and tap this Birds down with a Scion. We have double Smasher in hand, so once we draw a removal spell, we are going to be able to win. There's a Grafdigger's Cage, so let's go ahead and play that. Even though we haven't really seen Chord of Calling yet, it would make sense for our opponent to have it, considering all of these one-of creatures we're seeing. And we can just go ahead and commit a Reality Smasher to play. We don't need to play the second one. So now it's just a waiting game here. Our opponent's fetching still, so they're willing to take some damage off of their lands to thin out their deck. Restoration Angel would definitely be annoying because that could blink out the Eternal Witness, and then that would find a Path to Exile. So here's an activation of Celestial Colonnade. And if our opponent attacks with the Colonnade, we're just going to go ahead and fire off the Ghost Quarter on it to get rid of it. And by doing that, we didn't actually have to use a Scion to tap anything this turn. There's a Noble, so what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to chip in for 2 actually now with the birds. Alright, so we've got it in for 2, and let's just go ahead and play our last card in hand. We're Hellbent. And so we're just going to go ahead and tap the birds down because we don't need all of these Scions anyways. Pretty crazy game here. Not too sure what the current lists of Chord decks look like, but I haven't seen this one before. That's for sure. There's another Noble, which makes us even more incentivized to tap the birds down. I think we were going to anyways. Alright, Matter Shaper. Now we're wishing that was an Eldrazi Sky Spawner, but fortunately it's not. So now all of a sudden we're actually ahead in the damage race. It does look like our opponent's deck has a ton of lands in it because it is 5 colors. I wouldn't be surprised if our opponent has Chord of Calling in their deck and it has now drawn it. But now we have Grafdigger's Cage in play. Would not be surprised if that was the case. Just because we haven't seen the card does not mean we're not playing against it, because, I mean, it's pretty hard to imagine some of these cards being, not just being singleton one-ofs to find. If our opponent has drawn a Path, it looks like Path was drawn. So we can just go ahead and tap the birds down. We don't need to tap anything else down. And we don't really need to shuffle, so we're out of basics at this point. And there's another copy of Matter Shaper, so okay. So now our opponent's actually going to be able to start hitting us, which is pretty bad news. We still haven't drawn one of our 5 removal spells. We also haven't drawn another copy of Displacer. And there's a Siege Rhino, so now all of a sudden we're behind in the damage race. Our opponent's going to clock us down to 5 now. So we have a lot of cards we can draw that would be good here. And it's a land. So we may end up losing this game. It's a little bit frustrating, but we'll see what our top cards of our library provide. Definitely was not thinking about the Magus. So assuming our opponent doesn't have much in hand, we're just going to go down to 3 here. If our opponent has a resto or something, they can just resto the Rhino and the game's over. So, yeah, let's just go ahead and get in there with our birds. So, yeah, I mean, if our opponent just attacks us down to 1, now all of a sudden we'll have 1 draw step here, and if we don't hit, we can still potentially use the birds as a chump blocker. So we didn't get there. So let's just pass the turn. Been a pretty crazy game here. Alright, here it is. What's it gonna be? There's Reality Smasher, so alright. On to game 3. Was not expecting that card. We can board in some flyers if we want to now. Eldrazi Sky Spawner seems pretty decent, especially against the Magus, so maybe we want to board in a couple instead of the Matter Reshapers. I think I like that. I think we still want some of our big stuff. We definitely still want the Dismember, the Paths. So let's go with this. Also have to think about the clock time because we only have 6 minutes left on our clock. So going to try to win this one quickly, hopefully. So, all right, this is a keep. It's a turn 1 birds. We're going to name bird with the cavern. And then we have a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer. We are missing more lands, but we also have Ancient Stirring. So if our opponent had gone, say, Lightning Bolt our birds, that would have been very annoying. Pretty unclear what is actually in our opponent's deck. We see now a Raging Ravine, so hard to know what the mana base is. And wow, we're seeing a bunch of stuff here all of a sudden. Birds, Noble Hierarch, Witness, Rhino, Sigarda, and Thragtusk. So I think we want to take the Siege Rhino. If our opponent just had one of the 1-drop accelerants, we would probably take that one. Siege Rhino is the card that you can potentially ramp into on turn 3, so I think that's the one we're going to take. And let's go ahead and cast this Ancient Stirrings. Alright, we found an Eldrazi Temple. Let's just take the Temple. That's going to allow us to play Drowner on our next turn. So we know our opponent has Witness, has Birds, Sigarda. If our opponent plays a Thragtusk, we're going to have Drowner in play, so we can potentially use Drowner to tap some things down if we want to. And Ghost Quarter is pretty nice, considering the lands we're seeing right now from our opponent. So we can leave up Path to Exile and cast this Drowner. And this is why the deck has 4 Drowners, is because sometimes you draw 2 and you're very happy you still have another one left in case your first one dies somehow. Like, our opponent is under a ton of pressure right now. They can play the Thragtusk we know about, but we're still able to tap it and then get in for a bunch of damage. Sigarda is another option, so it looks like that's what the play is going to be. So I think we want to just go ahead and get in with this Drowner. Yep, let's do it. If our opponent wants to trade the Sigarda off, that's fine. Looks like that's not going to happen. So we're just going to go ahead and commit a second Drowner. We drew a third Drowner even. So even though we can't tap the Sigarda itself, I think we're in pretty commanding position here. We'll see what our opponent can do. If it's the Magus, we can path it. And it is the Magus. So we know our opponent has Eternal Witness and Thragtusk in hand. So I think we're going to be able to win this game on our next turn. This Sigarda is very different from the one in Standard. It does have hexproof. We're just going to take the damage here. There's really no reason not to. And, yep. Just going to fire this path off. And that should be the game. For a little bit of overkill, let's go ahead and play this Drowner. Why not, right? And, yeah. So, we can still sacrifice our permanents with Sigarda. We just can't make our opponent sacrifice permanents. So, it's still okay against our deck, I guess. But, plenty of damage coming through, and that's going to be the match.